since we haven't been around for millennia, do you honestly believe they still remember us?" Leaning back in his chair with his arms folded, Gareth gazed out the enormous window of the orbiting station below Earth, where a blue and green marble spun, seeming more serene than it has in ages. The younger aliens in the galaxy had long since ceased fearing humanity, but that was about to change, so they don't need to remember. Sat a small group of elderly soldiers and veterans of war who had long forgotten they weren't really youthful anymore. Humanity had been isolated and sidelined by its own choice for the past few hundred years, at least for those who weren't paying attention, because other species didn't want them involved in galaxy affairs, claiming that humans were too aggressive and dangerous. Humanity had retreated to the periphery, abandoned by a galactic council that was more than happy to push them away for generations, during which time they thrived in their own systems, keeping to themselves. But the galaxy had fallen into disarray, alliances had fallen apart, disputes between species heated up, and the balance of power shifted. At first, it was just whispers, a few desperate ambassadors from weaker species asking if humans still had their legendary fleets. Then, it became more open, with frantic requests for aid flooding human communication lines. Species that had previously been too proud or arrogant to speak to humans now begged for help. The Galactic Council, now trembling under the pressure of Catherine expansion, reluctantly sent a formal request, asking the humans to assist in negotiations. Dominion, an empire of reptilian aliens, was on the verge of conquering half of the known galaxy. They ruled with an iron fist, obliterating any opposition, and enforcing their will with ruthless efficiency. Better negotiations, Gareth and James recognized, were a thinly disguised request for one thing. "You believe we can pull this off, war?" Gareth tapped his fingers on the table and said, "They've been doing things their way for a long time, so it doesn't matter that we're not the same as we used to be." James said as he stood up and walked towards the console. He flipped a switch, causing a galaxy map to emerge in front of them. Red areas are shown. Catherine-controlled areas. It wasn't about whether we could pull it off or not, it was about reminding them why. In reality, humanity hadn't lost its edge over the centuries while the rest of the galaxy was preoccupied with treaties, trade disputes, and small-scale conflicts. The map was almost bleeding. Humans had been silently honing their military technology for generations, turning war into a discipline and a science. However, they had learned patience and time, and now humans use time as a weapon just like any other, and we already had the fleet on reserve. James kept navigating through the console's data. 24 attack ships, 3 carriers, and enough firepower to remind all living things why they used to shudder when they saw tan insignia. They believed they could get by without us, but now they're going to discover what they've been missing, which makes Gareth laugh. "I assume we're not going to do this quietly," since he rose and stretched his ancient bones, creaking as he did. James smiled. "We're not very good at subtlety." A third guy entered the room as the door swung wide, his uniform shining with clean metal on his chest. Although he was younger than the others, his presence instantly took up the space. "We're all prepared," said Captain Marcus, a rising star in the recently resurrected Turan fleet, who had been handpicked to lead the charge. The council had formally approved the operation, and we were cleared for full deployment. Gareth arched an eyebrow, indicating how desperate they were. Marcus nodded. "The council is in a panic mode and will now consent to anything since the Kron just took over another system." James grinned, and I assumed they had forgotten about us, but they made an effort. "However," Marcus said, "there are certain things you just cannot forget." There was a brief silence in the room. They all understood the importance of what they were going to do, which was to demonstrate to everyone that humanity had not become weak and that the forgotten power of Earth still loomed over the galaxy, waiting for the right opportunity to strike. The weight of what was about to happen was hanging in the air. With a low whistle, Gareth broke the silence, saying, "So we're really doing this back into the fold after all this time." James gave him a pat on the back, and it seemed to be the case. "What happened next?" Gareth asked. "Once we remind them who we are," and Marcus looked at the map. "We'll cross that bridge when we come to it." The sound of boots echoed down the hall as soldiers started boarding the ships. The entire station was alive with the excitement of preparation, as the first of the assault ships detached from the station. It's amusing that he said they wanted to leave us behind because they believed they could manage everything on their own. Now that they're about to collapse, who do they call? Its engines were flashing blue as it got ready to join the fleet. The hum of engines filled the room as the ships started to line up in perfect formation, and Gareth laughed. I suppose there's only so long you can ignore the people who wrote the book on warfare. The old Turan and insignia, a simple symbol that once inspired both fear and respect in equal measure, were about to do so again. We've been silent long enough. Marcus said the first ship jumped into hyperspace, setting the stage for a conflict that would remind the galaxy of the Achaean fleet, which hung in space like a constellation of predators, each ship armed with weapons and shields that had destroyed hundreds of civilizations under the leadership of High Marshal. As the galaxy looked out at the fleet, let's remind it of what happens when humanity returns to the fight. With a combination of disinterest and disdain, Kesh stood on the bridge of the biggest Dren, scanning the battlefield. The Galactic Council's last-ditch efforts to build a defense were pathetic. More of these insects were delivered by patchwork fleets of lesser species that were barely holding the queue. The Council's ragtag caused Kesh to snarl and narrow his reptile eyes. He glanced to his second-in-command, whose scales glistened anxiously beneath the ship's lights as the fleet shuddered under yet another onslaught. High Marshal, the police responded, but we've seen another, unidentified fleet just join the system, and although we are now doing scans, no trends have been found. For the first time in many days, Kesh's eyes glowed with curiosity. You respond, yes, sir, and it's enormous. The ship shapes are strange, but they're developing swiftly. Kesh moved forward, gazing at the holographic map. The Catherine had destroyed everything in their path, but there were few unknowns these days, especially since so few people dared to oppose their power. He watched as the enigmatic fleet moved swiftly and precisely towards the front lines, his claws tapping the metal railing and sending a hail. He said, "Let's see who's stupid enough to challenge us." After a few seconds, the communication officer looked up, his face plastered with astonishment. There was no answer, sir. They weren't even recognizing our signal. The tactical officer's eyes widened as his monitor came alive with alarms. Hello, Marshal, enemy ships are locking onto us. Kesh smiled with sharp teeth. They'll regret that just now. I don't understand, they've bypassed our jamming fields completely. Kesh growled at his previous before he could give the order to fire. The first volley from the human fleet hit massive kinetic rounds that smashed into the Kron ships with surgical accuracy, shattering shields and tearing through holes like paper explosions. The battlefield was illuminated, and entire sections of the Kron's forward line disintegrated on the human flagship in a matter of seconds. Amusement fading is impossible because no fleet has that capability. The command crew worked well, carrying out each order with the accuracy of well-being, while Captain Marcus watched the carnage unfold with a steady gaze. Trained memory for muscles, how are the Catherine responding? They didn't rejoice or celebrate since this wasn't the time for that. Humans didn't need grand speeches or bluster because this was battle, and that's what they were created for. When Marcus questioned, one of the officers said, "They're frantically attempting to redeploy their troops, but we've already disrupted their formation." Marcus gave himself a little nod in order to maintain the pressure on their flagship and break off their chain of command. Gareth looked at the tactical display while seated at a secondary station. The issue is that I almost forgot how good we are at this. From the other side of the room, James claimed they forgot as well. The humans moved with a precision that verged on brutal efficiency, and the Catherine, unprepared for such a large-scale attack, frantically tried to reorganize, but their forces were already dispersed. Each time they did, another wave of human attacks would break through their defenses, leaving chaos in their wake on the Kethan flagship. Return fire was causing Kesh to get enraged and destroy those ships. Even as he yelled commands, he knew something was amiss because the humans were out there, navigating them at every turn and attacking at their weak spots with terrifying precision. He growled his claws into the command panel. As the battle raged on, the human fleet continued to rip through the Kethan forces with ruthless precision. Their weapons were advanced, but it wasn't just the technology that gave them the edge, it was their strategy, their ability to adapt on the fly to exploit every weakness with surgical strikes. The Kethan were powerful, but they fought with brute force. "Hi, Marshal, our systems can't lock onto their ship," one of the officers yelled. "They're jamming technology, it's far beyond anything we've seen." Kesh slammed his fist against the console, but for the first time in his career, he felt something unfamiliar gnawing at the edges of his mind. Humans, on the other side, battled with knowledge and expertise that could only be forged by millennia of conflict from the Kithron flagship. Looking up at Marcus, one of the communication officers said, "I thought your kind had vanished, crawled back into the shadows where you belong." Marcus didn't flinch. "Looks like you were wrong. You dare challenge the Kithron Dominion. We have conquered half the galaxy. We will grind you into dust. You've conquered half the galaxy because we weren't around to stop you," Marcus said, his voice steady. "That changes today. You think you can stand against us? We outnumber you 100 to 1. Marcus took a quick look at the tactical display, which showed that the human fleet had begun its attack while the Kithron troops were still having difficulty regrouping. "This isn't arrogance, it's experience." As another Catherine ship burst in the distance, Kesh yelled in rage as he saw his fleet being picked apart piece by the relentlessly meticulous humans. They showed no compassion in their strikes, no hesitation, only cold calculating annihilation. For the first time in decades, the galaxy was starting to recall why humanity had once been dreaded above all others. Gareth sat back in his chair and shook his head, saying, "It's almost unfair." James responded, keeping his eyes fixed on the screen, but justice never mattered in battle. As the ship sank under the relentless assault, Kesh's dreadnoughts violently shuddered as another round of human fire ripped through its defenses. Alarms sounded, and the crew frantically tried to retake control, their reptile hands quivering. As he struggled to understand the catastrophe that was happening to him, his mind raced. "This can't be happening," he roared, slamming his fists onto the command console. "We are the Kithron, we don't lose," he said, but even as he spoke, the truth set in. "Hello, Marshal, our shields are failing, we've lost over 70% of our fleet." One of his officers sounded, his voice shaking, "We can't hold them off any longer." In order to prepare for a complete retreat, Kesh bared his teeth and refused to accept reality. He ordered the surviving ships to return to our secondary line, but there was no secondary line left since humans had destroyed it before it could ever be created. Kesh's empire on the human flagship, the powerful Kron Dominion, which had governed over many planets, was disintegrating more quickly than he could react. Marcus observed with the same cool. The Galactic Council's last-ditch efforts to build a defense were pathetic. More of these insects were delivered by patchwork fleets of lesser species that were barely holding the queue. The Council's ragtag caused Kesh to snarl and narrow his reptile eyes. He glanced to his second-in-command, whose scales glistened anxiously beneath the ship's lights as the fleet shuddered under yet another onslaught. "Hi, Marshal," the police responded, "but we've seen another, unidentified fleet just join the system, and although we are now doing scans, no trends have been found." For the first time in many days, Kesh's eyes glowed with curiosity. "You respond, 'Yes, sir,' and it's enormous. The ship shapes are strange, but they're developing swiftly." Kesh moved forward, gazing at the holographic map. The Catherine had destroyed everything in their path, but there were few unknowns these days, especially since so few people dared to oppose their power. He watched as the enigmatic fleet moved swiftly and precisely towards the front lines, his claws tapping the metal railing and sending a hail. He said, "Let's see who's stupid enough to challenge us." After a few seconds, the communication officer looked up, his face plastered with astonishment. There was no answer, "Sir, they weren't even recognizing our signal." The tactical officer's eyes widened as his monitor came alive with alarms. "Hello, Marshal, enemy ships are locking onto us." Kesh smiled with sharp teeth. "They'll regret that just now. I don't understand, they've bypassed our jamming fields completely." Kesh growled at his previous before he could give the order to fire. The first volley from the human fleet hit massive kinetic rounds that smashed into the Kron ships with surgical accuracy, shattering shields and tearing through holes like paper explosions. The battlefield was illuminated, and entire sections of the Crone's forward line disintegrated on the human flagship in a matter of seconds. Amusement fading is impossible because no fleet has that capability. The command crew worked well, carrying out each order with the accuracy of well-being, while Captain Marcus watched the carnage unfold with a steady gaze. Trained memory for muscles, how are the Catherine responding? They didn't rejoice or celebrate since this wasn't the time for that. Humans didn't need grand speeches or bluster because this was battle, and that's what they were created for. When Marcus questioned, one of the officers said, "They're frantically attempting to redeploy their troops, but we've already." Composure he had shown throughout the war as the Kron fleet collapsed. The kind had been strong, but they were predictable. They depended on overwhelming might and instilling terror in their foes, but fear no longer meant anything to humans or fleet rank. Marcus inquired in a tone that was controlled. Minor damage was done to all ships, and an officer reported that we had lost none and that they were disintegrating well. The tactical display zoomed in on Kesh's dreadnought as he hobbled away from the battlefield in a frantic attempt to avoid the inevitable, to which Marcus answered, "Target their flagship, it's time to end this." As he delivered the last command, Marcus leaned forward a little and narrowed his gaze. The human fleet unleashed its full might, tearing into the Kithron flagship with a focused bombardment of kinetic rounds and energy beams that briefly sent debris spiraling into space and breaking her hull. Kesh remained silent as he saw his empire, the culmination of his life's labor, fall apart around him. How could this happen? He asked himself. As the ship collapsed, the alarm shrieked, the viewports filled with light and fire, and the human onslaught struck. The atmosphere was calm and professional. There was no celebration or boasting. This was just another mission carried out with the same cold deficiency that humanity had perfected over centuries. Kesh, High Marshal of the Catherine Dominion, was no more as the wreckage of the flagship drifted through space and the remaining Catherine ships surrendered one by one, their once proud fleet now little more than a tie-in of battered survivors scattered and broken on the human flagship. When one of the commanders announced that we had prevailed and all enemy ships were standing down, Gareth sat back in his chair and rubbed his weary eyes. This went better than anticipated. When we became serious, Marcus turned to the bridge crew, his face inscrutable. James laughed gently, knowing that they would never have a chance. He sent a message to the Galactic Council informing them that the Kethan Dominion was ended, but what about the rest of the galaxy? "Every species in the world has been watching this," Gareth said, "and they all wanted us back after seeing what we did." For centuries, humanity had been content to watch from the sidelines as the galaxy played its games of power and politics, but now the game had changed. The galaxy had called on humanity for help, and humanity had responded, reminding everyone why they were feared in the first place and that we wouldn't return to being forgotten. Marcus said simply, "Now they've got us." There was a moment of silence as the implications of that statement lingered in the air. Softly, James said, "They will never forget again." As the human fleet started to reorganize in preparation for returning to their home systems, Marcus nodded, his eyes focused on the stars outside the viewport number they won't. However, as the Galactic Council sent out a single transmission, it contained a message of relief and gratitude, but it also contained a message of fear that the humans, now reawakened, might not stop with just the kind. "Do you think they're afraid of us now?" Gareth inquired, looking at Marcus. "They ought to be. We didn't come here to conquer," Marcus said without hesitation, "but now they know what we're capable of and they'll think twice before ever sidelining us again." The remnants of the nicked fleet left behind served as a sobering warning to the galaxy as the fleet proceeded its silent retreat into hyperspace. Though his eyes remained on the stars, Marcus allowed himself a small smile at that. The galaxy had changed today, and they all knew it, but humanity's role in that galaxy had only just begun. "Let's head home," Marcus said, standing from his chair. "We've reminded them who we are, and that's enough for now." The fleet vanished into the void, leaving behind a galaxy that would never be the same. Humanity had returned not as conquerors, but as a force to be reckoned with, a forgotten power that had just proven it could still turn the tide of any war.